Welcome to America's Forgotten Founders, where we will look at people whose contributions to the American Revolution, whether on the battlefield, in the halls of power, or on the home front, have been all but forgotten by the annals of history. Before diving into the forgotten story of our first founder, we must set the scene by looking at the social, cultural, and political context of the period we're about to explore. This prologue will give us the necessary insights to make the most out of this series. So let's get started. After all, we are all, to some degree, a product of our time. Early Americans were no different. And while we will tell their stories from beginning to end, this series will emphasize events between the introduction of the Stamp Act in 1765 and the ratification of the U.S. Constitution in 1788. This time frame isn't perfect by any means, but looking at these 23 years in particular will allow us to cover the significant events of the Revolutionary Era and our forgotten Americans' role in them. We will also, on occasion, deviate from this timeline to examine how, why, and when we remember the stories of the Revolutionary Era. There are many myths out there. Part of this series will be deconstructing, contextualizing, and understanding those myths. Of course, the tale we will be telling here will be incomplete. To tell a fully comprehensive narrative would take at least a book, if not an entire career, not a 15-minute video. Throughout this series, we need to recognize that the American-British conflict did not spontaneously emerge out of nowhere. It had always been there on the periphery, periodically flaring up and dying down, but always leaving an impression in the collective memory of the colonists. As many conflicts do, this conflict revolved around economics and trade. The Stamp Act of 1765 certainly wasn't the first time the colonists and the British clashed. As we all know, it wouldn't be the last either. The British Empire, like all other empires, aimed to enrich the mother country at the colonies' expense. Of course, the American colonies did not suffer the same deprivations and exploitation that non-white colonies did. Nonetheless, mercantilist policies forced the colonists to trade exclusively with Great Britain, even if they could get higher prices elsewhere. Mercantilism, if you're wondering, was the economic philosophy of Britain from roughly 1620 to 1840. Mercantilism, in practice, seeks to coalesce as much hard currency as possible by maximizing exports and minimizing imports to extract wealth from potentially rival powers. Suffice it to say, the colonists were not pleased. Smuggling was rampant, as was tax and tariff evasion. These policies, unsurprisingly, hit merchants the hardest, who were the most politically active group in the American colonies. Many of the people we would consider to be founding fathers were either merchants themselves or closely aligned with the interests of merchants. Who'd have thought? All that said, while we are studying the Revolutionary Era, let's consciously be mindful of our own cultural biases. To tell our tale, we must remember to view our founders and the time in which they lived through the lens of their own conceptions of normality, morality, and justice, rather than applying our modern standards. We cannot view the past with rose-tinted glasses. By putting our own beliefs by the wayside, we can avoid presentism. Presentism is the problematic introduction of modern-day ideas, perspectives, and morals into interpretations or depictions of the past. By reinterpreting the past from our current perspective, we often fall into the trap of feeling morally superior and rejecting our ancestors' unique and compelling stories. If we set aside these preconceptions, we can develop a deeper appreciation of the beliefs, contradictions, and complexities of our founders and gain insight into their world by exploring their diverse perspectives, experiences, and thoughts. Perhaps we can better understand ourselves and our world. At any rate, discussing the legacy and the proper remembrance a historical figure deserves because of their now controversial beliefs is a meaningful conversation, one our country will and should continue to have. Still, it's not a conversation we will have here. We need not glorify them or their beliefs, but we should remember their stories. But we must remember the true stories of those who have come before us instead of the myths that have been created around them. Now will be a good time to address the myth of the United Founders. The founders of the United States are often portrayed as these titanic figures of destiny who, through the righteousness of their cause and singularity of purpose, were fated to win their independence and throw off the yoke of a tyrannical king. We often see the people of what would become America and the founders themselves as united. This is a myth. Many founders and their fellow citizens were sharply divided on several issues, with each holding different, incompatible, and often opposing beliefs. A strong sense of attachment to their respective states was pervasive, with any concept of a larger American nation being a distant thought for many. For instance, there was no idea of the nation at the Revolution's onset. The concept of national identity, which we take for granted today, was in its infancy at the time of the American Revolution. A nation which is a community of people formed on the basis of a combination of shared features like language, history, ethnicity, culture, and society, was not then widely held or understood. And although many founders, such as Thomas Jefferson, Benjamin Rush, and Noah Webster, wanted to create a school system that would instill in children a sense of nationalism, the project never got off the ground, because it lacked public support. The average American citizen did not feel the same as their founders. Many still clung to their regional identities for decades. This gravitation towards regional identity was so pronounced that some historians have argued, quite convincingly, that the contested character of American nationalism allowed for and even encouraged conflict and dissent about political identity. The United States of America was born as much, if not more so, from internal dissent and conflict as it was from unity and harmony. We also need to discuss the early political divisions that strained the unity of the new republic almost to the breaking point, even though Washington, in his farewell address, pleaded with his fellow countrymen to always exalt the just pride of patriotism more than any title derived from local differences. It appears his fellow citizens ignored that advice, dividing themselves into the largely New England-based Federalists who favored a strong central government and the primarily Southern-based Democratic Republicans who advocated for states' rights. As the young country polarized into political parties, we saw the introduction of the partisan press, in which the news organizations sought to harangue and demonize their political rivals. Many of us believe that the hyperpartisan media we currently have today is an outlier in our nation's history, but this is not true. In fact, I'd argue that it was even more biting and toxic during the beginning of the nation than it is now. Consider just one example. Noah Webster was the Federalist publisher of The Herald, a gazette for the country. This paper was highly critical of many Democratic Republicans. The Democratic Republican press, feeling slighted, launched a barrage of personal attacks on Webster, with many calling him, among other things, a prostitute's wretch and a great fool, a barefaced liar, a spiteful viper, and a delusional academic. The Federalists, defending one of their own, returned the favor. Federalist papers across the country began denouncing the Jeffersonian Republicans as the refuse of nations and vile old wretches, even frog-eating, man-eating, blood-drinking cannibals. While such descriptions may seem humorous to us today, in their context they most certainly were not. In a democratic nation governed by the will of the people through free and fair elections, political violence, or the threat thereof, has no place. As much as these men may have been titanic figures of destiny, they certainly were not united. Even amongst themselves, the new parties were bitterly divided. The Democratic Republicans, for example, were further divided into three factions: the moderates, the radicals, and the old Republicans. The moderates sought compromise with similarly minded Federalists, the radicals favored further economic and political reforms, and the old Republicans rejected any compromise with the Federalists, wanting instead to return to the Confederation style of government. The issue of slavery was another source of division within the Democratic Republican Party. While those from the Deep South supported the institution, Northern Democratic Republicans were the strongest advocates for abolishing it. Thomas Jefferson, an old Republican, believed that slavery was immoral, but accepted it on economic grounds and hoped his successors would abolish it, or as he put it himself, "I hope, under the auspices of heaven, for a total emancipation, and that this is disposed in the order of events to be with the consent of the masters, rather than by their eradication." His hopes of consent would, as we know, fall short. The point is that the founders, both between and among themselves, had more differences than similarities. When we discuss the past, especially something as romantic as our country's origins, it's tempting to paint with broad strokes. That way, our narrative fits neatly in with our preconceived ideas, cultural biases, and nationalistic myths. But history is far more complicated than that. For example, though we've all heard about the founding fathers of the United States, few of us have ever stopped to consider that phrase's etymology. But if we pause for just a moment to reflect, we may ask ourselves, were all those who laid the foundation of the United States men? Were all those who sacrificed before the Tree of Liberty men? The answer is a resounding no. But to understand how and why the myth of the Founding Fathers was created and has been perpetuated, we need to look at two seemingly unrelated concepts: the role of women in society during the Revolutionary Era and the process of writing history until the late 20th century. Women were sequestered in the domestic sphere for various cultural and social factors, far away from the political struggle that gripped revolutionary America. This isn't to say women did not participate in the revolution or were not instrumental in its success. Far from it. But women frequently participated in political life more indirectly than men. For example, women played an essential role in organizing and enforcing the boycotts of British goods that played a central role in the early resistance movement. Many women also participated in the homespun movement, weaving uniforms, clothing, and blankets for domestic consumption as well as for the Continental Army. Some women even took this a step further by accompanying the Continental Army as camp followers, civilians who followed an army, serving as washwomen, nurses, seamstresses, supply scavengers, and porters, though not all did so out of purely patriotic zeal. Some women could not afford to run their households with the husbands away. So, to avoid poverty, they accompanied them on campaign instead. For those who were able to remain at home, they managed the household and any businesses their husbands owned. They planted and harvested the crops. They raised the children. They managed labor and finances. And yes, a few women even fought in combat, with some serving unexpectedly during the heat of battle, such as the semi-mythical Molly Pitcher, and a few disguised themselves as men to serve in the Continental Army, like Deborah Sampson. Of course, much like in later wars, when the conflict ended, women were supposed to return to their traditional gender roles. As we've seen, women played a crucial role in the overall success of the revolution. We must ask ourselves why their story has gone largely untold. When we look back at the past, we often confine ourselves to studying religious, cultural, political, economic, and social trends, to conflicts and wars, figures of historical importance, and nation-states. But we rarely look at the historian. We don't often think about who wrote history or why, but we should. As George Orwell, one of the most prolific writers of the 20th century, wrote in 1984, "He who controls the past controls the future. He who controls the present controls the past." And men, white men, controlled the present during the Revolution. John Adams, the second president, expressed this sentiment bluntly in a letter to a friend. History is not the province of the ladies. Adams wrote those words regarding a book published by Mercy Otis Warren, one of his ideological rivals, who fiercely criticized Adams' Federalist views. But rather than engage in a meaningful debate and use his legendary oratory skills to defend his views, he sought instead to invalidate Warren's words by pointing out she was a woman. Even though it should be added, Adams was one of Warren's main supporters early in her political career. Unfortunately for us as historians, women weren't the only group our predecessors largely omitted from the historical record. Any discussion about early America would be incomplete without discussing race and slavery, especially because this is a hot-button topic today. This will be an excellent place to wrap up this video. The Founding Fathers, generally speaking, were neither vehement anti-slavery activists nor staunch opponents to the subjugation and enslavement of other human beings. Except for the Deep South, where slavery was vital to the economy, many of the people we'd consider founders were ideologically opposed to slavery, though this opposition took on many different forms. And we must be careful here. Just because a founder opposed slavery for philosophical reasons does not mean they saw African Americans or Native Americans as racial equals. As we conceive of them today, equal rights did not exist for women, African Americans, or Native Americans. While many founders found slavery the antithesis of the Revolution, they nonetheless viewed African Americans as well as women and Native Americans to be untrustworthy, childlike, and fundamentally inferior to white men. Many doubted the ability of African Americans and women to vote in elections and be productive citizens. Were they truly smart enough to vote? Did they deserve to play a role in politics? For what it's worth, this very critique was also used by the anti-suffragette movement in the 1910s. But I digress. At any rate, by our definition, these men were undoubtedly racists, but they reflected commonly held beliefs for their day and age. For example, we just heard about John Adams and his view on women. John Adams also had a personal objection to slavery, he never owned slaves, and he hated the institution. Yet, he kept the issue out of national politics, seeing this issue as a significant roadblock to national unity. He thought, and even hoped, that future generations would tackle the problem. On the other hand, Thomas Jefferson owned hundreds of enslaved people on his Monticello estate. He never freed his slaves. Of the 9 presidents who owned slaves, Washington alone freed them. It is known Jefferson fathered 6 children with a 1/4 African American slave, Sally Hemings, though it is unsure exactly what the dynamic of their relationship really was. As the president of the Thomas Jefferson Foundation explained, "We really can't know what the dynamic was of this relationship. Was it rape? Was there affection?" His personal life notwithstanding, Jefferson, arguably the most intellectually gifted founder, disliked also the institution of slavery. He argued that the practice of slavery harmed both the master and the enslaved. There must doubtless be an unhappy influence on the manners of our people produced by the existence of slavery among us. The whole commerce between master and slave is a perpetual exercise of the most boisterous passions, the most unremitting despotism on the one part and degrading submissions on the other. While we might find the sentiment callous, comparing the suffering of someone enslaved and their enslaver, it nonetheless argued that slavery not only damaged slaves, but also harmed the master by allowing them free rein over another human being. This phrase clearly shows Jefferson's disillusionment with slavery as an institution. He also thought that by perpetuating the institution, perhaps their children, who he, much like Adams, hoped would abolish slavery, would continue the tradition. Our children see this and learn to imitate it, for man is an imitative animal. If a parent could find no motive either in his philanthropy or his self-love for restraining the intemperance of passion towards his slave, then how will their child? Jefferson then embodies the complexities and contradictions of the founders. No, of all people, really. He was a wealthy and well-educated white man who believed in his race's superiority, yet he fathered 6 mixed-race children. He thought slavery to be morally repugnant, yet he profited personally from the subjugation of hundreds of people. He was fearful of the effect slavery might have on younger generations, yet his children lived at his lavish estate built upon the backs of slaves. He, like John Adams, though ideologically opposed to slavery, chose to remain complicit in its continuation for the sake of unity. And though both broadly opposed slavery, neither thought of African Americans as their equal in any regard. As this video has illustrated, both men had commonly held beliefs about women as well. Abigail Adams wrote her husband in March 1776 to remember the ladies and be more generous and favorable to them than your ancestors. Do not put such unlimited power in the hands of the husbands. This phrase is relatively well known today. On the other hand, Adams' reply to his wife isn't much remembered. As to your extraordinary code of laws, I cannot but laugh. We, members of Congress, know better than to repeal our masculine systems. No better they did, indeed, for they created a system that gave women little in the way of rights. And the founders and their fellow citizens had no idea what to do about Native Americans. Thomas Jefferson, for instance, believed that the Native American peoples were a good race that possessed an innate moral sense, and that they were, in body and mind, equal to the white man. However, he also believed that they were culturally and technologically inferior due to their lack of exposure to Western culture, which implicitly argues they are unable to join the new American nation. While most everyone in colonial America would certainly be classified as a racist today, we cannot hold them to that standard. Yet we cannot totally absolve them of blame either. Many of them understood slavery to be a depraved institution that betrayed the very ideals the Revolution had at its core. Yet they all struggled to put their words into deeds, even in their private lives. Perhaps the greatest lesson our forebears can offer us, then, lies not in the romantic myths that surround them, but in their very human limitations, contradictions, and failures. We can learn from their trials, tribulations, mistakes, and imperfections to build on their complicated legacy to create a nation where all people are truly equal. To perfect the American experiment that they began. That'll do it for this prologue. I hope you found this video both informative and exciting. Make sure to like, subscribe, and comment. And make sure to join us next time as we uncover our first forgotten figure, the financer of the Revolution, Robert Morris.